The roar of engines echoed through the small town, breaking the usual quiet of Sunday morning. Dust stirred in the streets as a group of rough, leather-clad bikers tore through the town on their heavy motorcycles. The sound was deafening, and it was only a matter of time before the residents felt the weight of their arrival. The bikers, notorious for their lawless ways, had no intention of simply passing through. Their eyes locked on the one building that might as well have been a sanctuary in this quiet little town, the church. Inside, the morning mass was in full swing. The old wooden pews creaked as the elderly and young alike sat in reverence. Father Thomas stood at the pulpit, his voice calm and steady as he spoke of peace and faith. For many, this church was the heart of the community, a place of refuge and solace. But none of them could have anticipated the storm that was about to descend upon their peaceful lives. The doors of the church slammed open with a thunderous crash, sending everyone inside scrambling to their feet in shock. The bikers, all wearing dark, intimidating helmets and jackets adorned with patches, stormed in, their heavy boots pounding on the cold stone floors. They didn't say a word, but their presence was enough to send a ripple of fear through the congregation. Father Thomas, however, stood unwavering. He watched them closely, his face unreadable, as the bikers spread out across the pews. The sound of chains rattling and the clinking of weapons was unmistakable, but the priest remained calm, his eyes sharp with a deep, unspoken understanding. The bikers, with their violent reputation, were used to getting what they wanted by force, but there was something about Father Thomas that made them hesitate. As the leader of the gang approached the altar, his gaze locked with the priest's. It was as if the entire room held its breath, unsure of what would happen next. The tension was thick in the air, palpable like a storm before it broke. The biker smirked, sizing up the priest, but something in Father Thomas' eyes made him pause. He could sense it, a strange energy, something that didn't belong in a quiet church. "Nice place you got here," the biker leader sneered, his voice thick with mockery. "I wonder what your congregation would think if they knew who you really were." Father Thomas didn't flinch. His voice was quiet but firm as he responded, "I don't need to prove anything to you or anyone else." But the biker wasn't done. He took a step closer, and the entire room seemed to hold its breath. The gang members circled, watching, waiting for the next move, sensing the change in the atmosphere. It wasn't just a standoff anymore. It felt like something deeper was unfolding, something that none of them expected. "You think you're some kind of hero, Father?" the biker leader asked, his smirk widening. "You think you're safe behind that collar? The truth is, you're just another man hiding behind a mask. But I know what you really are." Father Thomas' expression didn't change, but the subtle tension in his jaw tightened. The biker leaned in even closer, his breath hot on the priest's face. "I know you were Delta Force. I know what you've done, and I know what you can do." The words hit like a bombshell, and the entire church seemed to fall silent. The bikers froze in place. Father Thomas' eyes darkened for a brief moment, as if something deep within him stirred. The peaceful, humble man they'd seen every Sunday was not the person they thought he was. As the words hung in the air, Father Thomas turned slowly to face the altar. He gripped the edges of the wooden structure, his knuckles white with tension. His voice, when he spoke again, was low and measured, but it carried the weight of something much more than a priest's authority. It was the voice of a man who had lived through hell and survived it. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," he said, his words slow but filled with a chilling finality. The bikers exchanged uncertain glances. They had come here expecting an easy fight, but now they were facing something far more dangerous than they could have ever imagined. The priest had no fear, no hesitation, and it was clear that his past, whatever it was, had prepared him for far more than they could handle. As Father Thomas turned back to face them, his eyes locked onto the leader of the bikers. There was a brief pause, a moment of recognition, and then the sound of the motorcycles outside grew louder. The bikers stood still, unsure of what to do next. The air was thick with anticipation, and everyone in the church seemed to sense that this confrontation would change everything. In that brief silence, Father Thomas took a deep breath. He wasn't just a man of faith. He was a force to be reckoned with, someone who had fought wars and seen things no one should ever have to. And now, in the midst of his quiet town, it seemed that his past was about to collide with the present in a way no one could have predicted. The bikers slowly backed away, but it was clear that this encounter was far from over. As they made their way toward the exit, the priest's words echoed in their minds. "You don't know what you've unleashed," he said, his voice low enough to be a whisper but powerful enough to leave a mark. And just like that, the bikers disappeared into the streets, leaving the town to wonder just what had happened inside the church that day. But one thing was certain: their peaceful town would never be the same again. As the door swung shut behind them, a cold breeze swept through the church, and Father Thomas turned to face his congregation. His eyes were distant, as if seeing something none of them could understand. The truth about who he really was, about the past that haunted him, was still locked away, waiting for the right moment to come to light. And for the first time in a long time, the small town realized they were no longer living in peace. The question now was, how long could they stay that way? The church remained eerily quiet as the heavy doors slammed shut behind the bikers, their engines fading into the distance. The air felt thick, like the calm before a storm, and no one dared to move. Father Thomas stood at the altar, his back turned, lost in thought. The congregation, still in shock, shifted uneasily in their seats. The children, who had been playing quietly in the back of the church, huddled together, whispering to one another. Their innocence had just been shattered, and the unease was palpable. Father Thomas hadn't flinched when the bikers had stormed in, nor had he shown any sign of fear. But now, with the church once again quiet, the weight of what had just transpired seemed to settle over the room like a heavy fog. For years, Father Thomas had been the pillar of peace in this small town, offering comfort and wisdom to those who needed it. He had been the one to listen to people's problems, to guide them through their darkest moments. But now the truth about his past, something he had buried so deeply, was out in the open. The bikers had known. They had seen through the facade, recognized the man beneath the priest's collar, Delta Force. The name sent a chill down anyone's spine. The elite military unit was made up of soldiers who had faced the worst of humanity, the kind of people who would do whatever it took to protect their country. Father Thomas, it seemed, was one of them. But why had he chosen to leave that life behind and take up the cloth? What had happened to him during those years that had shaped him into the person he was now? The questions lingered in the air, unanswered, but they gnawed at the hearts of the townspeople. They had trusted him. They had respected him. And now they wondered if that trust had been misplaced. Was he still the man they thought he was, or was there something darker lurking beneath the surface? As the congregation slowly began to stir, some people glanced nervously at one another, unsure of what to say. A few brave souls stood up and made their way to the exits, eager to leave the uncomfortable tension behind. But others remained drawn to Father Thomas, wanting to understand what had just happened. They had known him for years, but now they realized they didn't truly know him at all. One of the older women, Mrs. Richards, approached the priest cautiously. She had always been a loyal parishioner, one of the first to arrive for every Mass. She had trusted Father Thomas like a son, and now the weight of that trust felt heavy in her chest. She had seen the way the bikers had looked at him, as if they knew something she didn't, something that made them fear him. "Father," she said, her voice trembling, "what was that all about? Who were those men? What did they want?" Father Thomas turned slowly to face her, his eyes still distant, as if he hadn't fully returned to the present moment. The line of his jaw was tight, his features unreadable. For a moment, it seemed as though he might say nothing at all, but then he spoke, his voice low and measured. "They came for me," he said simply, "and now they know who I really am." Mrs. Richards didn't understand. She couldn't. She had spent so many years seeing Father Thomas as a man of faith, a man of peace. The idea that he had once been a soldier trained in the art of war seemed impossible. She couldn't reconcile the image of the kind, gentle priest with the man the bikers had described. Delta Force. The name still echoed in her mind, and it left her feeling uneasy. "Father, I don't understand. You're a priest. You've dedicated your life to God. Why would anyone be after you? What happened?" Father Thomas sighed deeply, his eyes flickering with a hint of regret. He took a moment before answering, as though the words were difficult to form. "I was a different man back then," he said quietly. "I did things I'm not proud of, things that haunt me to this day. But I thought I could leave that life behind. I thought I could start over, find redemption." He paused, his gaze falling to the floor. "But the past doesn't stay buried forever. It always finds a way to come back." Mrs. Richards stood silently, unsure of how to respond. The revelation about Father Thomas' past had shaken her to the core. She had never imagined that the man who had baptized her children, who had offered counsel and guidance during her hardest moments, could have a life so filled with violence and darkness. But now, as she looked into his eyes, she saw something else, something that made her question everything she had believed about him. Was he still the same man? Could someone who had walked in the shadows of war ever truly find peace? The room had grown quiet again, the air heavy with questions and uncertainty. The church, once a place of comfort and sanctuary, now felt like a place of unease. The members of the congregation exchanged glances, but no one dared to speak. The silence was deafening. Father Thomas, sensing the weight of the moment, finally broke the tension. He looked up, his eyes meeting those of the people in the room, his voice firm but calm. "I know you have questions. I will answer them when the time is right. But for now, all I can ask is that you trust me. Trust that I'm here for you. Trust that I won't let the past dictate who I am today." But even as he spoke the words, he knew they might not be enough. How could they trust him now after everything that had just happened? The bikers knew his secret, and with their reputation for violence, they would stop at nothing to exploit it. What if this wasn't over? What if they came back? Outside, the sound of distant engines grew louder once again. It wasn't the gang, not yet, but the noise stirred something deep within Father Thomas. A familiar feeling, one he had hoped never to face again. The past was coming for him, and was coming fast. The room seemed to hold its breath as the door creaked open, and a figure stepped into the church. Father Thomas' heart skipped a beat as he turned to face the newcomer. This was no ordinary visitor. This was someone from his past, someone who knew exactly what he had done, and perhaps even more than that. The town wasn't ready for what was about to happen next, but Father Thomas was no longer sure he could protect them from the storm that was closing in. The figure who had stepped into the church wasn't anyone Father Thomas recognized at first. His face was obscured by the shadows, but the lean, tall silhouette and the quiet, purposeful stride were unmistakable. A chill ran down Father Thomas's spine. The figure paused just inside the doorway, scanning the room with an intensity that made everyone uneasy. It was the sound of his voice that confirmed the priest's worst fear. "Father," the man said, his tone smooth, almost too calm. "I didn't think you'd be hiding out in a place like this." Father Thomas' breath caught in his throat. He felt a knot of tension tighten in his chest. It wasn't just that the man knew him. He knew him in a way only a select few ever had. This wasn't some random passerby. It was someone from his past. Someone who knew the dark things he had tried so hard to leave behind. The congregation shifted nervously in their seats. No one had seen this man before, but the weight of his presence was undeniable. His voice alone seemed to draw the shadows closer, to make the air feel thicker, more suffocating. And despite the tension in the room, Father Thomas remained calm, at least on the outside. Inside, memories flooded back, bringing with them a rush of fear and regret. The man didn't step forward yet. He simply stood, eyes locked on the priest, a smirk curling at the edges of his lips. The seconds stretched on, thick with unspoken history. "I didn't expect you to be this comfortable," the man continued, his eyes scanning the old, peaceful church as though he were inspecting a battlefield. "But I guess we all wear different masks, don't we?" Father Thomas stood still, his fists clenched by his sides. The truth about his past was never something he had been eager to face. But this man, whoever he was here to bring it all crashing down. "Who are you?" Father Thomas asked, his voice quiet but edged with a tension that made the room feel even colder. The man's smirk widened. "You know who I am. I was there. I saw you before you became this priest." Father Thomas' eyes narrowed. "That was a lifetime ago. What do you want now?" The man chuckled darkly. "What do I want? The question is, what do you want? You've hidden so well, Father, behind that collar, behind that holy facade. But I've never forgotten what you really are, what we all were." A sudden silence fell over the room. No one moved. The congregation, who had once seen Father Thomas as a man of virtue, now looked at him through the lens of doubt. The words the stranger had spoken hung heavily in the air, and for the first time in many years, Father Thomas felt the weight of his past like a physical burden. "You're wrong," Father Thomas said, his voice low but firm. "I left that life behind. I chose something different. I chose peace." The man stepped forward, his eyes never leaving Father Thomas's. He was now only a few feet away, and the priest could feel the tension rising in his chest, threatening to choke him. The man's words were slow, deliberate, each one carrying the weight of truth and accusation. "Peace," the man repeated with a derisive laugh. "You think you can escape what you've done? You think God will just wipe it all away? You were a soldier, Thomas, a warrior. You were trained to kill, to destroy, and you think you can just move on." Father Thomas took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. His mind flashed back to the years he spent in the chaos of war, the missions he had carried out under orders, missions that haunted him every day. The faces of those he had killed, the lives he had destroyed, were etched in his memory like scars that no amount of time could erase. He had run from it, hoping to bury it in the quiet of this small town in the solace of his faith. But this man, this ghost from his past, had dragged it all back to the surface. "You don't know anything about me," Father Thomas said, his voice more forceful now, though the anger in his tone barely masked the fear inside him. "Oh, I know more than you think," the man said, his eyes gleaming with a twisted satisfaction. "I know exactly what you're capable of. I know what you've done. I know why you've been hiding here. You think you can outrun your past, but it's catching up with you." The congregation sat frozen in their seats, their eyes darting back and forth between the two men. They could feel the intensity of the exchange, the threat hanging in the air. None of them understood the full scope of what was being said, but they could sense the danger. Outside, the hum of the motorcycles returned, louder now, their engines rumbling like a warning. It wasn't just a few bikers anymore. It sounded like an entire gang was revving up for another round. The tension inside the church intensified. The door had barely closed before it felt as though another storm was bearing down on them. Father Thomas' mind raced. He couldn't let the gang return. Not after what had happened. But with this man standing in front of him, and the bikers possibly regrouping outside, there was no telling what would happen next. The man in front of him chuckled softly, sensing the priest's turmoil. "You're not in control here, Thomas. Not anymore. You've been hiding in plain sight, but you can't run from your demons forever." Father Thomas turned his back on the man for a moment, his eyes scanning the church. The familiar pews, the stained glass windows, the altar, these had been his refuge, his sanctuary from the hell he had lived through. But now they felt like nothing more than a cage. The man in front of him wasn't just a remnant of his past. He was a threat, and not just to him, but to everyone in this church, everyone in this town. "What do you want from me?" Father Thomas asked, his voice now thick with urgency. "Why are you here?" The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he let the silence stretch on, drawing out the tension in the room. Then, with a slow smile, he finally spoke. "You've been hiding from your past, Father," he said, "but the past doesn't forget. And neither do I. I come to collect what's owed." Father Thomas felt a shiver run down his spine. What was this man talking about? And what did he mean by collecting what's owed? As the sound of approaching motorcycles grew louder, the questions swirling in his mind grew louder too. The past, the bikers, the man standing in front of him. It was all coming together in ways he wasn't prepared for. And as the door to the church creaked open again, Father Thomas realized with a jolt that the storm wasn't just coming. It was already here.